Hey, everybody. This is Vegan Theology, episode 29 with Kevin and Sarah. What's going on, Sarah?
We're back, baby.
We're back. Yeah, it's been a few weeks.
We do apologize.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a few weeks that we have not been consistent at getting in front of the mic, and it feels really good to be back.
Yeah, we've been yearning to get back and discuss vegan theology. But part of the reason we've been out, we've been busy. Sarah's been, she can talk about it, but finishing up preschool, and Sarah finished a yoga teacher training cert, and she's also started another cool endeavor. So
Yeah, so those of you who have had kids in school or have ever been in school, or if you've ever been a teacher in a school, you know that especially the last month, just intensifies with each passing day as you're trying to finish up, year-long projects, and there's ceremonies and, oh my goodness, just so much extra work, really. I was thinking about it. It's like, you know how there's some pop songs that they didn't write an ending to for some reason? It just kind of gradually fades
away. Yeah.
Like they just keep playing the chorus and it just fades to silence. That is not that is not a good metaphor for a school year. A school year is much more like a song in which the composer really went all out on the ending.
Oh.
And it intensifies and intensifies and intensifies. Because, this past month we've had Grandparents' Day and our last recitation. And like I said, getting ready for Mother's Day and getting all these year-long projects finished up and sent home. And we're about to have book festival and field day. And oh my goodness. So every day just is a lot of extra work.
Mm.
And I've been a preschool teacher for basically most of my adult life, honestly. In different states that we've lived. And I've loved it for sure. But early this school year, I started really praying daily, is this my last year? And God has really confirmed that for me. So I'm thankful for that. So one chapter is ending and new chapters are beginning. And part of that freed up time of not being a preschool teacher, I hope to really, not hope, I don't want to say hope, I want to say I have committed that is going to be devoted to vegan theology and putting more work into our podcasts and other vegan theology endeavors that will come along. So that's been one reason we've been incommunicado last few weeks. And then, like you mentioned, for the past 8 months, I've been working on my 200-hour yoga teacher certificate. And a few weeks ago was our final weekend. And it was intense.
Yeah.
I mean, those weekends are always intense every month. But the final weekend, there was a written test that took us about 4 hours to complete. And then we had to teach each other a yoga class. And so if you do the math, there's 18 people in the class. And every one of us is teaching a yoga class. So Saturday, Sunday, we were doing several hours of yoga. So physically exhausting, very stressful because you want to do your best. And we're not seasoned teachers yet. So it's pretty stressful.
Right.
I was really preparing for that for several weeks. And then the other thing that started a few weeks ago is many of our listeners are probably familiar with the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, otherwise known as PCRM, founded by Dr. Neil Barnard, who has proven that people can reverse type 2 diabetes with a plant-based diet. So he started this Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, and one of their programs is to train people to teach food for life classes in their communities and online. And so I was accepted into that program a number of months ago, and it just started officially a few weeks ago. So that's been taking up a lot of my time as well.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Which I'm really excited about too, is being able to teach community members. They have several classes. They have a diet to reverse diabetes, as I said, but they have the heart healthy diet and the anti-cancer diet. And the funny thing is, right? If you take some of these classes, is you're going to realize the answer or the special diet to make sure you don't get any of these diseases is, guess what? A whole foods plant-based diet.
Right.
So it's almost like that's what we were created to eat.
Right.
If we want to be healthy.
And so what? You'll teach a class and you'll, like, if somebody takes a class on reversing type 2 diabetes, so then somebody take the class and what? You would teach them meals,
Exactly.
recipes?
Yeah, they get all kinds of literature, so science-backed studies and literature. So it's not like I have to become some kind of medical researcher expert. Every class has a video that we watch. That's Dr. Neil Barnard explaining the science behind the diet. And then we do a cooking demonstration and they get the recipes and we get to sample this wonderful food and find out that eating whole foods plant-based is very tasty and can help us feel great.
That's awesome. Yeah, well, that's good. It's exciting.
It is exciting. Do not be alarmed or worried. We're not going anywhere. We're still going strong, and we still have more than enough ideas of things we need to talk about and explore in this. We are your humble theologians who are fumbling our way along, trying to create this framework of vegan theology.
Yeah.
Before we get into theology too much today, I did want to give a shout out to one of our listeners, Chris, who wrote us a very thoughtful response to our Palestine show. And first of all, we're still in the phase of, I can't believe anybody's listening to us. You know, like, I can't believe anybody would give of their time, which we all know is so precious, and actually listen to us with interest. Like, that's still so touching.
Yeah.
So not only did Chris listen to that episode, but he took the time out of his life to write a really thoughtful response to some of the things we said in that Palestine show. And Chris, I have not written back. I haven't responded, partly because of some of the aforementioned reasons. It's just been super intense and busy, but I really do appreciate your email and we will be getting back to you. But since we're on the subject of Palestine, I did want to share a little tiny bit of good news in that situation. I read that Union Theological Seminary, an affiliate of the School of Columbia, has become the
Columbia University.
Yeah, I'm just reading here. That's how they wrote it.
Is that how they wrote it?
So it's an affiliate of Columbia University, has become the first U.S. institute of higher learning to fully divest from Israel. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw this. So a Christian theological seminary is leading the way in their decision to divest from Israel. Union Theological Seminary's Board of Trustees voted today, this was the 9th of May, to divest from all companies profiting off the genocide in Palestine. The Board of Trustees at UTS will start selling all of its shares of the companies identified to be financially invested in the genocide. We have a very good investment committee who are completely at a moral level committed to seeing this through. This was written by Reverend Serene Jones, who is the president of UTS. This is a major win for the divestment campaign, not only at Columbia, but nationwide. This is only the beginning of the domino effect that will inevitably follow, according to this person who posted this. We must remain steadfast and refuse to capitulate in our demand for divestment. We will settle for nothing less than complete divestment by every single college within Columbia University. This victory is only the beginning. Part of why this is so good to my heart, I feel like it's just nourishing my heart to learn this, because one of the things I find myself thinking regularly is, why does it seem like the church or Christian organizations are always at the end of the line when it comes to movements of justice and movements of love and rights? And so often it seems like we resist any change. We resist any challenge to the status quo. And then eventually, once everybody else has gotten on board and been like, oh, actually, yeah, you're right, slavery is bad or whatever, then finally the church gets on board. And I know that's an oversimplification.
Right.
I know there's always faithful people who are part of the rights movements. But so often I'm like, man, this makes the church look so bad that we're so often the last.
Yeah, I wonder if it's more of the conservative evangelical churches or conservative
So,
churches that are sitting back, not being good stewards of creation.
Yeah, but I would definitely say it's mainstream.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, like we mentioned in that episode, Christianity today is very mainstream, I would say. And they were basically just giving the Zionist narrative on this.
Right. I also feel, though, that I could be wrong, but I think Christianity Today is a mainstream evangelical publication.
Totally.
Not necessarily liberal. There are other great theological journals that are not like Christianity Today. So
Yeah, so in the last few weeks, a lot of students at a lot of different colleges and a lot of professors at a lot of different colleges have started protesting and calling for their schools to stop supporting or stop being invested in companies that are supporting Israel. So I just wanted to read one more thing before we leave this topic. In our Palestine episode, I referenced Norman Finkelstein, who is an expert. First of all, his parents were Holocaust survivors, and he's an expert on Jewish studies and also on Palestine. This is what he said recently. The dead can't be brought back to life, but it's still possible to save the living. President Biden announced today that he won't supply certain weapons if Israel attacks Rafah. Even if this policy shift saves only one life, still that one life might be your own. It was primarily the student demonstrations that forced this change. Let it weigh heavily on the conscience of every university president contemplating the expulsion of these students. You are punishing young people who have saved lives that, but for the grace of God, might have been your own. Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and if you're unfamiliar with what Rafah is, it's the area of Palestine that Israel told the Palestinians to go and they would be safe there. This has happened repeatedly over the last 7 months. Israel tells the Palestinians to go somewhere and they'll be safe there, and then Israel carpet bombs that place. So yeah, I guess Biden has said he's not going to have full support for that.
All right.
Okay.
No, it's good. I mean, this episode, I think, we've talked about, we're going to get into animal sacrifice and everything that has to do with that. And I feel like one of the things we're trying to do in this podcast is some ways discover as best we can what the truth is, how we got here. How did our tradition, the Old Testament tradition and the New Testament tradition and our Christian tradition, how do we come to this sense of sacrifice, animal sacrifice, and then the ultimate sacrifice of Christ, but then this whole concept of atonement and all those things. And we really want to try to unpack those things. And of course, as Sarah has mentioned here, time has not necessarily been on our side the last few weeks, been very busy. Myself included, this past week at work has just been putting in 12, 13-hour days. It's been a rough week. But at any rate, I think this episode is just going to maybe be a bridge almost to talk about maybe a bit of theological method and presuppositions as we work our way towards getting into animal sacrifice. And I think it's funny, the last episode, I almost was going to title it something like Prolegomena or Prolegomenon. And
what's that word mean?
I think it means like introductory materials, like prologue on our way towards something, setting up maybe our assumptions and our frameworks and the ways of thinking about things. But anyway, this episode could potentially be called Prolegomena too, or Prolegomena. So at any rate.
Yeah, I think part of what got this conversation started was I was having some kind of internal dialogue one day, and so I started talking to you about it. I think because I was imagining that a criticism that someone may level against us and what we're trying to do here could be, okay, you guys clearly have your own little niche agenda, and you're just looking at Scripture through this very particular lens, and you're cherry picking the things that seem to line up or support your agenda, right? And the more I thought about that, and I came home and started talking to you about it, the more I thought about that, it was like, well, as we know, and I think we should talk about in depth a little bit, every single person that's ever come to the text, ever, has presuppositions, has an agenda, whether or not they are aware of it, whether or not they admit it. nobody comes to the text objective,
Right.
like without any preconceived notions.
Right. Yeah, it's funny you say that. I remember thinking, because obviously I studied philosophy and theology, and so many times, I don't know, it's just an aside, but there's so many times when I was thinking about when I was applying for a job and, you submit your resume and you talk about all your job experience. There were times, I wouldn't say even as a joke, but almost being serious, but no one would take it seriously. I was always thinking about creating a resume of my epistemology and my assumptions. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is how I think. And I would think some employers might really want to know, how does this guy think about, how is he going to attack a problem? Anyway, of course, no one would take that seriously, but.
That reminds me of Dwight Schrute. When he would offer up his resume, he would always offer up, here are my athletic and special skills resume.
Right. So anyway, no, I agree with you. It's if you're human,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, if you're a living human, you have pre-understandings and you have presuppositions.
You have your culture that is completely invisible to you. And that's the thing is, none of us, no matter how careful we are and try to be, we can never, in my opinion, according to me, I don't think that we can ever fully be aware of every single bias and blind spot and culturally hardwired bias that we have. I mean, probably the only cure, if there is a cure, is to listen to people who disagree with you.
Right.
And then go back to why you think the way you do and question it.
Well, yeah, listen to the counter arguments and see if they're valid and honestly think about the actual merits of what they're saying. And so I remember reading The Gagging of God by D.A. Carson. And in my view, D.A. Carson's a heavyweight and I respect him. And I remember in that book, he talked about being aware of our presuppositions as best we can. As we're approaching the text, we don't want to, our goal at the end of the day when we're reading the biblical text, and depending on your theological method and your hermeneutics, your interpretation, you have assumptions as you approach the text. And so he would say, I just remember this, like being aware of your assumptions, your biases is the best you can do. Like they're there, you can't undo them, but you can be aware of them and hopefully not allow them to influence your reading of the text. And so we use the terms when we're trying to read out the meaning in the biblical text, we use the terms exegesis. We want to read out the meaning, but the opposite of that would be injecting your views into the text, which we would refer to as eisegesis, reading into the text. So that's not what we're trying to do with this vegan theology, but I believe it's something that can come up. And I think we're bumping into this among our church friends and other Christians. And so I think similar to what you're saying, being aware of our presupposition, but I also sometimes think of it as a practice. Like the more that we practice being aware of our presuppositions or our cultural biases and our national biases, like the more that we practice it and think about it, the more we can be aware of them. I just want to harken back to something you were saying is that there are some people that are unaware of their biases. And I would say they're mostly cultural biases. And those cultural biases are, they're smaller communities and just where they're from. And so in their minds, this is the way the world is. This is who we are. I feel like whenever you hear a statement like that, this is just who we are. Accept me for who I am. Well, you're basically saying, the way I understand that is you're not willing to flex. You have your cultural biases and you're not willing to grow.
Or even have the curiosity to wonder, what would it be like for a minority woman? How would a minority woman read this compared to, we get very fixed in the one predominant narrative.
Right.
And I think part of the process is having some curiosity. Like, I wonder how someone else might read this text.
Right.
That would be so different than the way I would read this text.
Right. Because I feel like that does play into what you said. Like if you hear another person's interpretation of the text and how they might view it, it totally opens up your understanding and your biases of how you've been reading the text. Yeah. And then you start to question like, And this isn't about questioning who God is, God's character. I would argue that at the end of the day, the framework we're trying to build and our theological method is very theologically sound, in my opinion, of course.
Right. Right. That's why it's so nice when we're like, and it's not just us, it's Andrew Lindsay, and it's, all these.
Right.
I would also like to add that growing up in a very fundamentalist, conservative, evangelical church and college, the one group of people that has maybe the hardest time admitting that there might be other ways of interpreting things are the most conservative fundamentalists. Like, I was raised being told, oh, there's a right way and we know it.
Right.
And this is the right way to interpret. And when someone might bring up a possible contradiction within the Bible, it was almost like, no, there can't be any contradictions. And if we could just figure out the proper interpretations and finesse both of these just the right way and have the perfect understanding, we would see that there's no contradictions within the text. And when I was talking with you about this earlier in the week, Kevin, I loved the point you made that whether you come out of fundamentalism or you come out of Catholicism or you come out of Church of the Brethren or, a covenant church or a Reformed church or what have you, you need to be aware that you have been given a theological framework. You have been given a lens through which to view the Bible.
Right.
Whether it was stated to you that way or not, you have been given an agenda. You've been given a paradigm for how to approach the text. And no matter what kind of church you go to, and I'm sure many of our listeners have experienced this for themselves, you're going to find that each particular flavor of church, you're going to find that they seem to emphasize these types of scriptures, and they tend to ignore or de-emphasize those types of scriptures.
When it plays into what you were getting at, like if somebody was going to accuse us or any theological framework or interpretation of bias or having preconceived assumptions, I think what we're trying to say is we've already said that that's true of everyone. But I think what I want to emphasize right now is there is no neutral position. Maybe you can get kind of close to God's original intention. That's easier said than done. But I think what I'm trying to get at, there might be some people, some conservative Christians who might think their position is the neutral position, and any deviance from that position is liberal or evil or heretical or something to that effect. If there is a neutral position, we may not be able to attain it, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, which, this kind of conversation could cause someone to throw up their hands and say, okay, since it's obviously impossible to be objective, and we're dealing with this ancient text that has been translated and interpreted
and copied and miscopied and
for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. So it's probably had some corruptions along the way, depending on your view of inspiration. Like, why even try? Like, why even have these conversations? Like, we're going to get it wrong. And I guess we believe, just as human beings created by God, we're never going to be able to just skate and turn off our brains and stop trying. There's this curiosity within us and a drive within us to seek God's face.
Well, there's also engagement. He's called us to be stewards of his creation.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean sitting back and being armchair theologians and discussing what we believe. It's actually getting our boots on and getting out there and actually doing the work.
And it's deceiving yourself to even believe that's an option, because what I've witnessed, everybody has a theology, whether they want to call themselves a theologian or not, that colors their lives and colors their decisions and informs their relationships. And so whether or not you want to wrestle with God and wrestle with your theology, and you do have a theology that is going to affect what kind of life you're going to have.
Right. And in that vein of theological method and having personal theologies, the question becomes, depending on kind of everything we're talking about, our presuppositions, our pre-understandings, our assumptions, how do they color and influence our theological method, our own personal theologies? Because we all have one, right? And that's also why we go to church and read, is we're trying to align our theologies with God's original theological intention. What that does is that causes you to then potentially ask yourself, what is influencing my theology? What are the sources of my theology? Is it the Bible? Is it your culture? Is it your church tradition?
Mm-hmm.
Is it your view of politics or what strain of politics? Do you know what I mean? Like, what is influencing your own personal theology as you read your Bible and you make decisions about your life and the life of others and the life of animals throughout the day? That's what theological method is all about, and that's why we need to have these discussions.
Yeah.
Is because if we just go along and accept without questioning, then we run into problems like culture influencing our decisions. We equate our own theological understanding with our own cultural understanding. They're the same. And then if they're the same, you're not really questioning either one.
Yeah. So case in point, vegan theology, right? Like somewhere along the road, and we would frame it this way, I believe. God started working on our hearts to consider animals. And it's not like either one of us were raised with a vegan bent at all, right?
Right.
So something started to change within us, and we would describe it as God's work within us. And so, yes, we admittedly are curious about how this affects theology, and maybe some of the culture that has informed mainstream theology has missed the mark, at least when it comes to creature care, creation care, and what is God's opinion about the rest of creation besides humans?
Right.
And so, yeah, we admittedly have an agenda, just like every person who comes to the text. We have an agenda, but then this is where we're trying to keep ourselves honest. It's not like we want to start throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We want to faithfully question Christian culture and Christian theology and see, is there something here? Is there something plausible and faithful about a new theology that takes the rest of creation into consideration?
Right. No, exactly. We want to question our tradition. And I think that's a good thing. And that plays into, I think this past week, I was scrolling and I came across this video of a theologian, philosopher that I respect, William Lane Craig, and we actually saw him in a live debate in Chicago at Moody Memorial Church. I think it was 1999, but he was debating John Dominic Crossan, and it was during that whole historical Jesus era, and I think it was something titled like, "Will the real Jesus please stand up?" They were debating traditional understanding of Jesus versus historical. And so he's someone that I've studied. I've read his books. Like I said, we went to a real live debate with him in a philosophy of religion class. We had to read a lot of his work. He's an apologist. He's, like I said, he's well studied. He's got degrees. He's a smart guy. He understands theology. But listen to this little piece. I'm just going to play a little clip from this, and maybe we'll just talk about it.
This is an example where people who claim to be Bible-believing Christians actually are reading things into the text that are not there. Namely, the idea that there was not animal death and pain prior to the fall of man. There is nothing in Genesis that suggests that animal pain and death is the result of the human fall into sin. It's not in Genesis 3 when God curses the man and the woman with certain curses. For example, that your bread shall be won by hard toil from the earth, or the woman shall have pain in childbearing. It's not in Romans 5 where Paul talks about how death spread to all men because all have sinned, and Adam was the one through whom sin came into the world. There's nothing in Scripture that suggests that animal death and pain is the result of the fall. And so I find it terribly ironic that here is a case where people who think of themselves as very literal Bible-believing Christians are actually reading things in between the lines of Scripture that are not there. So, in any kind of viable ecosystem like the earth, there is going to have to be animal predation in order for the ecosystem to survive, even if it's just insects eating one another or birds eating insects. And when God looks at the ecosystem that he's created on this earth, he says it is very good. Indeed, the scripture says in the Psalms that the young lions cry out for their prey, and God gives them their prey. This is part of God's created order. So I don't see any incompatibility between the goodness of the created order and the fact that there is animal predation and pain. This isn't, as far as I can see in Scripture, the result of sin. This is...
Okay. So that was William Lane Craig responding to a question at some conference or seminar he was giving, and he runs the Reasonable Faith podcast. So again, well-respected apologist, decorated with all kinds of degrees, smart, logical. He's proposed all kinds of philosophy of religion arguments that many Christians use today. I mean, like I said, well-respected, but I have something to say, but what is your reaction when you hear that?
I was very discouraged when I heard that. And when you suggested, hey, let's play this on our podcast, I think my question to you is, how are you going to get us back on track after listening to that? So I can't wait for you.
Let's put this on me now. Okay. No, I just feel like, I think one of the things we've been talking about in this podcast, and again, here's a guy I respect, but I think one of the things we've been talking about on the podcast is this idea that a lot of our theology, a lot of our mainstream Christian theology is very anthropocentric. And I feel like William Lane Craig, I'm guessing he's in his 60s. He might be pushing 70 by this point. It's, he's worked within this anthropocentric frame his entire life. And for him to suggest, I think both of us just don't believe this. I think that's one assumption that he has. The one assumption we can say about his theology. I think the second assumption, and I think this is something we don't talk about enough as Christians, is this idea of the fall, the effects of the fall. I know as in the circles we come from, personal sin is always the big deal. And whenever we talk about the fall, original sin comes up. But a lot of times I would love to have a discussion sometime. And I remember I tried this at church one time, and I feel like it just didn't go anywhere. But what if we weren't talking about personal sin, but we were just talking about the effects of the fall? And I remember someone responded like, well, it might be too hard to dissect that. Well, we do all kinds of conjecturing on other aspects of theology and other aspects of Christian living. So let's talk about this. Let's just say you woke up in the morning, you had your quiet time, you read your Bible, you prayed, you meditated, and to the best of your ability and knowledge, you haven't really sinned today. Mm-hmm. Okay, as crazy as that sounds. All right, but you live in a fallen world. You're fighting an uphill battle just because of the world you live in. Yeah. As a result of the fall. And I feel like Christians aren't thinking about this. We keep hearing, well, it is what it is, or this is the world we live in,
That's just the way the world works.
That's just the way the world works. And it's like, this is not God's original intention. Yeah. And I think for William Lane Craig to say that, well, predation, I can't think of a world where we can't have predation. Yeah. Well, how about the world before the fall? How about the eternal state where it says there will be no predation? Right. And how about this? How about Noah's Ark, right? This was after the fall. God must have done something to defy the laws of nature for the time that the animals were on the ark, right? Because if we're reading the text as literally as William Lane Craig is, they were on the ark for maybe a year, a little over a year. Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you imagine? The whole point of them being on the ark was to preserve animal creation to start again on a renewed or a clean earth. So the question then becomes, if predation was running wild on the ark, we wouldn't have the world we have now.
Yeah, I agree. So first of all, one of the thoughts that came to me now that I've listened to it a couple times is, he's like, it's nowhere in Genesis 3 that, now all of a sudden there's going to be death of animals. Oh my goodness. So where to even begin with that? I guess where I was going to start is, well, you've neglected to mention Genesis 9, which I think the fact that it didn't happen right away even strengthens our case that God really does not want predation. He doesn't want lives to be taken. It takes God until after the flood to finally say, okay, fine, you can kill and eat. And it's this very qualified, as we've talked about in a previous episode, it's a very qualified permission. In Genesis 1, when God says, I want you to eat plants and I want all the animals to eat plants,
and by the way, the animals are hanging out with Adam and Eve, right?
Yeah, so William Lane Craig neglected to mention Genesis 1, the commandment from God for humans and animals, all animals, is to eat plants. Okay, so he didn't mention that. Then it takes God until after the flood for God to give very qualified permission to kill for food. And in that same passage is where God says, I'm going to put the fear of man in animals.
Right.
Which means previous to this point, animals did not have fear.
Right.
I mean, so again, he's like, Bible-believing Christians are just reading between the lines. I'm like, oh, really? Are we? Because I feel like we're building a case here.
Right. I think the text seems pretty clear. If God is putting fear between humans and animals, that says something about predation. He's injecting predation into the creation. And I would say somewhat the same when God curses the serpent in Genesis 3. He says to the serpent, I'm going to put enmity between you and the woman and her children. I mean, I'm going to put some conflict between.
Right. Because, a lot of traditions want to see that purely as a Christological prophecy, which it is, instead of seeing it on the ground what it literally is, which is enmity between humans and animals.
Well, I think also, I'm reminded, I think one of our first episodes, we were talking about the whole creation story, what we might call the creation myth. Our creation myth compared to other ancient Near Eastern creation myths. And I think we tried to make the case that there was no death and destruction and ripping apart gods to create the world. God spoke the world into existence. It was very peaceful. It was very nonviolent. Yeah. And if that's God's character and it's woven into the fabric of creation, and that's going to be the eternal state, then why would there be predation? Why would that be the norm?
And so this assessment, where we are landing and where he is landing, in a way, has everything to do with what we conceive to be God's character. Because he just said God calls it very good for animals to have pain and be killed. And we are landing on that doesn't seem consistent with God's character as we're interpreting it. Right. We believe that God's character does not call it good when there's pain and death, the loss of life, the exploitation of his creation.
Right. And the funny thing about it is, to me, William Lane Craig is a very logical theologian.
I know.
And I know. And I find it strange.
Well, we run up against this so often. I mean, I'll see people who seem so wise and so enlightened and so devout, and yet in my mind they have this giant blind spot.
Right.
And I liked what you said too, that just because you haven't experienced and you can't imagine an ecosystem that does not have death involved, like that's what you're going off of.
Right.
Just because you can't imagine that there could be, in some possible world, there could be an ecosystem that does not require the death of anything or anyone. Just because you cannot imagine it does not mean that's not a good enough argument.
Well, to me, I find it hard to believe you can't imagine it. I mean, imagine reading Genesis 1 and then reading Revelation 21. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
And then go watch animal videos of them going after each other. I promise you, the animal that's getting chased and bitten into by a lion doesn't want to be the wildebeest or the hyena. Mm-hmm. They do not want to be attacked. They do not want to be eaten. They are trying to get away.
The other place I go with these kinds of arguments, I went here with this argument, is why are we so keen to limit the effects of the resurrection? Why are we so keen to limit the goodness of God? Why are we so keen to limit the love and compassion of God? We're always like, oh, God is all love and God is going to make all things new. But we say that only thinking about human beings.
Right.
No, that is not what this text says. It
Right.
says that God is going to make all things new.
Right.
That God is love completely, not just for humans. God is love for everyone.
Well, to me, and that plays into the idea, and again, I want to talk about my presuppositions. I still want to believe in what we might call the classical Christian God, that there is a single God. He's maximally great. We might call him a maximally great being. And obviously, logically, there can only be one being that's maximally great. I want to believe that God is a person and that he has these amazing attributes. And within conservative Christian circles, the Christians that do believe in a classical Christian God versus, say, a free will theism or an open theism God, that God can't see, say, beyond the horizon, that he's not omniscient, that he doesn't have all the characteristics of a classical Christian God. And we can get into that in some other episode. But my point is, even among many, I would say, Reformed theologians or many conservative Christians, they always emphasize God's love. And in the process of emphasizing God's love, that somehow it gets warped into this whole concept of justice, that God is so loving and his justice is so amazing that he has to basically punish us.
We have to satisfy his wrath.
Right. We have to satisfy his wrath. But the thing is, we never, ever really talk about, we say it, we never talk about God's peace.
Yeah.
We never really emphasize his peace as much as we emphasize that love aspect and this.
How quickly God forgives.
Right.
Yeah.
And his mercy. And it's just strange to me that you've got these people, and I know we talked about it last episode, we need to get there, but why are we going to destroy one part of creation to build up another part of creation?
The only way that makes
inconsistent.
sense is if God does not care about part of God's creation.
Right.
And that part of creation is here, but they're basically worthless. They only have worth for how they can serve us.
Right. They're instruments.
And again, that does not resonate with the character of God.
Right. Well, the framework we're proposing, too, that God also has covenants with animals that don't include us. So if we're killing animals, we're kind of intervening into that covenant that God might have. And also, we'll get into, and I think this is something I was thinking about this in the process of thinking about this episode, is the lack of, as we're learning more about how amazing animals are and all the, in essence, superpowers that animals have. They can fly. Birds can see colors humans can't see. I mean, the list goes on. Their senses are so, in some ways, stronger and better than our human senses, and yet we're going to judge them based on our intelligence. But also, I get at the end of the day, it's people read in Genesis 1 that we are stewards and caretakers, and we should have dominion over these animals, and somehow that gets overemphasized to mean we can do whatever we want with these animals or with creation. So, anyway, that was an excursion into that. Okay, along these lines, too, I think this is a fairly decent argument as well, but I've been reading David Bentley Hart's book entitled All That Shall Be Saved, Heaven, Hell, and Universal Salvation. And at the beginning of this book, he relates this parable, and I'm probably not going to do it justice, but I want to get to a point, and that is that, God is punishing these people in hell, and somebody from hell is maybe reaching out to a living human priest and saying, hey, can you pray for me and maybe get me up to the next level of hell so I don't have to suffer so much? I mean, I'm paraphrasing this.
Yeah.
And so this priest had compassion on this person that was this spirit or whatever, this person that was in hell. And the moral of that is that God put this person in this hell and was torturing them. And yet one of God's creations, a priest, had more compassion and more mercy than the Creator himself. Now, does that make any sense?
Right.
And yet here we have Christians like us and other Christians, Creation Care Church and other people that we're finding on the Christspiracy community are seeing all of God's creation and having compassion on all of God's creation. And yet we've got other Christians who are telling us, no, that's wrong. That's not what God intends. It makes no sense. Again, how can the creation have more compassion and mercy than the Creator?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned Revelation 21 earlier, so I thought it might be a good way to send us out.
Sure.
Today, are we ready?
Yeah, I think so.
To be sent out.
and just to say, we are on our way toward animal sacrifice and unpacking that and trying to get into lifting up the hood on the Old Testament and maybe getting into some of the historical and cultural references and religious references within the ancient Near East, some of the pre-understandings of the Old Testament. So we're on our way to doing that.
Yes. Revelation 21, verses, I think I'll read 1 through 4. This came to my mind because you mentioned it, but also our pastor, whom we love, just started a sermon series on Revelation and put together this playlist because I didn't realize so many of our worship songs and hymns come from the text of Revelation. So I've been really inspired recently about this book. So Revelation 21, 1 through 4, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling of God is with men. He will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. And God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning or crying or pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And again, I don't think we're reading between the lines when we say that God is a God who is going to get rid of death, pain, crying, mourning. Those things are going to pass away. They have never been consistent with God's character.
Or his intentions for creation. Yep.
Yeah.
That's amazing. It's gorgeous. Can't wait.
Can't wait. Let it be.
All right. Hey, thanks for joining us. We will catch you next time.
Bye, everybody.